So here we
Okay.
have Christopher Kent, and we're going to let the waiting room flood in now. If I do this properly, admitting all. Dun, 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 dun.
I'm seeing names pop up.
So, hello everyone. We have Dr. Christopher Kent here with us. And here at Sherman right now. Oh, there's more people coming in. Join.
iPad, that's an interesting name.
There's one called Apple.
Ah.
So while we let everyone
Oh,
join,
there's some a body part I can't even identify. I saw what could have been fingers, knees, or who knows what across the screen there.
So hi guys, we've got Dr. Christopher Kent. We'll start probably in a few more minutes. I grew up, before I even decided to become a chiropractor, I was listening to his voice, his sweet voice, right? Because he does something really cool called On Purpose with Dr. Patrick John Temple, and it's an audio subscription service for chiropractors. That's like ingrained in my head because I hear that every time. And it was actually really cool. They actually talk about science, they talk about politics, they talk about what else is there? Philosophy.
Philosophy.
And then I think, when did you guys start doing practice stuff? Right? Has that always been there?
Well, we've been doing On Purpose for over 20 years, and we've had a variety of guests that are kind of in the rotation that are regulars, and some of them deal with practice issues, some of them deal with chiropractic history. It's kind of a fun thing, you know. Well, the fact that we're still around after 20 plus years says something, and I enjoy doing it. We just did one yesterday, and you know, a lot of fun stuff on neuroimmunology and the relationship between the nervous system and immune function, and some of the political craziness that's going on, and of course some inspiring philosophy. We had as our guest Steve Marini, who in addition to being a chiropractor is a PhD in immunology, and he was talking to us. So anyway, it was a great program, if I say so myself.
Yeah. And I like how my sister and my brother-in-law, they would be excited to get it in the mail. This is like 10 years, no, this is like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And then they would like put it in everywhere we drove. We would be listening, okay, let's go next track, let's go next track. And it's awesome. But that is actually all digital now. I have it
Yeah. Well, we still have CDs for those who want them. We started with cassettes, and when nobody was able to make them for us anymore, we had to switch to CDs. For a while, we offered both, and now we're available online. You know, you can stream it. We have apps that you can use on portable devices, or you can download an MP3 or whatever. And as I said, for those who enjoy waiting a long time for things to come in the mail, we still have the CDs.
I remember you gave me a bunch. So I got the privilege of taking Dr. Christopher Kent back to the airport because he came to the Wave back in like
I remember that.
2010.
I'm not sure when that was. That was, I think, the first Wave. That's when Brian Kelly was, whatever they say, inaugurated, installed, whatever, as president.
Yeah. And I remember asking you in the car, I'm like, hey, what's some of the best research you can give someone to let them know what chiropractic is? And then he's like, well, what kind of science would they accept?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and like that's really kind of blew my mind. I'm like, that's true, because there's science out there, there's research out there, but if it isn't credible to them, probably won't really take it.
But amazingly, all this COVID-19 stuff, which has no basis in science, it's basically conjecture, computer models, things of this nature, they're okay with that.
Yep. So I think when you want to know something, everything's valid.
Yeah.
All right, let's give.
So tell me when, and I'm ready to begin anytime.
All right. So then let's get started. I'll just go through a few slides while people come in. So Dr. Christopher Kent actually does a lot of things. He has so many hats that I picked a few to share with you. One I think is on purpose, which is really important because the audio subscription service can really level up our game. You know, you can listen to the science, listen to the politics, listen to the philosophy and the practice building stuff. And I think that's so key for us to grow, especially in this age. Sometimes we're all on our own, especially in Asia. Like we don't necessarily get time to hang out together, so we need to get more TIC into us. So I thought that was super helpful. These CLA products, I don't use them so yet, but I do think they're very good, and I think maybe Dr. Kent can talk about that a little bit too, about how that can be used to measure things as well. But Dr. Christopher Kent, I've asked him to speak about kind of, you know, some really important science stuff that is chiropractic related that maybe we can arm ourselves with, and how to kind of explain chiropractic in a more salutogenic model, which can take it beyond pain-based, take it beyond RCTs and stuff like that. So that's kind of the purpose of this call, and very grateful that he came on. Last week, John Stenberg showed this slide and is talking about what Sherman's doing, being the first college to have this cone beam CT unit. And then on the left side of the screen there is Dr. Christopher Kent. So he's everywhere, he's involved, and we got a preview of him already. And unbeknownst to most people, he's actually a lawyer and a fighter pilot. You have a fighter pilot's license? A pilot's license.
No, I'm just a private pilot, but I did some aerobatic instruction in a fighter jet.
Fighter jet, I remember telling me that. So that is, if you need to get out of somewhere and quick, he can probably help you in many different ways. I'm gonna go right to this one. I want to start by saying thank you.
Oh.
It's early in the morning for you, and I think this call will really help transform how we go forward, because we're going to get new information at a deeper level, and you know how far-reaching it is. Like we have no idea. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Christopher Kent.
Okay, thanks. Let's see if I can get the PowerPoint up. It says you cannot screen share while the other participant is sharing. So I guess you have to unshare so I can
just
put mine on.
Bear with me.
Okay. I think, yeah, I think we're good. Hang on.
Spotlight.
Whiteboard Safari. Let me bring this up. Okay.
So while we're waiting, if everyone can also type in who they are, where they're from, where they're practicing, and stuff like that into the chat group, then Dr. Kent can see who's online. I see Alan Wu from San Francisco. I see Bing from Taiwan. Carmen from not Fulton, what I'm thinking. Oh,
why isn't my
in Hong Kong, a lot of
PowerPoint
Hong Kong chiros on here. We have a pre-chiro student, hopefully, Jackie Young. So Jackie's going to shadow me on Saturday, so I have to figure out everything Dr. Chris says today to explain to him. Cool.
I don't know why my screen share is not happening.
Let me see your screen now. See the whole screen.
Let's see.
I'll just see you.
I'm trying to get the PowerPoint to come up. And there it is. And
from Sydney, Sean from Hong Kong, Sean from Singapore as well.
Okay, bingo. I think we got it.
That's good.
Do you have the PowerPoint?
Yes.
With D.D. Palmer?
Yeah.
Okay, we're ready to go. So, how did it all begin? This is something that I think is really important in today's situation. And what Dee said was this: I desired to know why one person was ailing and his associate eating at the same table, working in the same shop, at the same bench was not. In other words, two people subjected to the same environmental dynamics, same job, same food, same home. Why was one healthy and the other not? And that's kind of what DD started chiropractic with, that concept. And I think of one of my mentors, the late, great Dr. Fred Barge. He wrote a great book called Life Without Fear. And if you haven't read it, please do, because the immunologist that we interviewed yesterday said that one of the greatest immunosuppressants is fear, and we have to overcome that. But Dr. Barge said there is but one cause in disease, and that's the body's inability to comprehend itself and its environment. What separates you from the chair you're sitting on is that you, being a living creature, having an innate intelligence, can adapt. Inanimate objects cannot. And the ability to do that, the extent to which you can respond in a qualitative and quantitatively appropriate way, determines whether or not you are able to fulfill your dreams. So, what kind of research is out there? Well, back in 1996, I encountered this paper, which I thought was very interesting because my focus is not on what diseases go away if a person gets adjusted. It's what sort of impact can regular chiropractic care have on one's quality of life. And in this case, they looked at senior citizens over 75 years of age, and they compared chiropractic versus non-chiropractic patients in an insurance database. And they said that the people who were under chiropractic care, who their insurance documents indicated that they had claims for chiropractic, reported better overall health, used fewer prescription drugs, and were more active. And they spent 21% less time in hospitals over the last 3 years. And I said, wow, isn't that great? If regular chiropractic care could produce those results, it would have a tremendous impact on both quality of life and economics, which are challenges today. Well, a number of years later, a team looked at senior citizens over 65 years of age. And because we have Medicare here in the United States, there's data available. And they looked at individuals who had so-called chiropractic maintenance care for 5 years or longer. And by the way, the bar was pretty low. They said if they just saw a chiropractor 4 times a year, they were included in that cohort. And they found that in those people, there were 50% fewer medical provider visits. And you might say, wow, you mean we could cut the cost of medical care in half? No, it's even better than that. They spent only 31% of the national average for healthcare services. In other words, not only did they utilize less medical care, the stuff they did utilize cost less. And here's the part that was pretty amazing. 95.8% felt their care was considerably or extremely valuable. Could it possibly get better? Yes. This is an interesting paper that was published in JMPT. Dr. Sarnat is a physician. He's a medical doctor. And he is in charge of a managed care organization. And he came up with a great idea. He said, what if we allow people to choose to have a chiropractor as their first contact provider? They say, you know, their primary person is going to be the chiropractor. What might happen? And he expected there to be some savings in musculoskeletal conditions, but the outcomes were absolutely amazing. There was a 60.2% decrease in hospital admissions, a 59% decrease in hospital days, a 62% decrease in outpatient surgeries, and get this, an 85% decrease in pharmaceutical costs. So these are real world data that can have a profound effect on public policy. So Alvin asked me to talk about salutogenesis. So what I wanted to share with you briefly was a concept that I developed one day on the proverbial napkin in a restaurant. And that's the concept of the TIC Triad. And the TIC Triad has three components. The first is salutogenesis, the second, adaptability, and the third, epigenetics. So the first time I heard the word salutogenesis, I said, boy, that is just a weird sounding word. I've never heard it before. And the more I read about it, the more enthusiastic I got about the concept. Salutogenesis literally means giving birth to health. It comes from salus, meaning health, invincibility, well-being, and happiness. Why do soldiers salute one another in the military? Why do we say salut when we toast someone? Because we're wishing them health and invincibility. We're wishing them well-being and happiness. And the World Health Organization defines salutogenesis as the process of enabling individuals and communities to increase control over and to improve their health. So it's a concept of empowering people to express health more effectively. And how does the World Health Organization define health? Complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. That's a pretty tall order. And sadly, even though they expressed this idea in 1948, they're still chasing specific diseases instead of looking at strategies that empower people to fulfill their potential and enable them to better interact with microorganisms, better able to enjoy health in non-infectious conditions. They're still chasing specific disease entities. So I would love to see them embrace this concept, this beautiful concept that they came up with in 1948. Came across an interesting paper a couple of years ago in Medical News Today, and they identified some people who genetically should have had a genetic disease, but they didn't. Although the gene was there, the expression was not. And they said most genomic studies focus on finding the cause of a disease, but we see tremendous opportunity in figuring out what keeps people healthy. And it's that paradigm shift that we need to see today. So it's adaptability that determines the scope of the human experience. As human beings, we have a choice. If your stress level, your adverse stress level is this big, and your adaptive capacity is only this big, you got a couple choices. You can either seek to expand your scope of adaptability, or you can say, I'm going to manage stress. I'm going to try and minimize stress. And in so doing, you necessarily narrow your scope of adaptability. As I've said, why do people jump out of perfectly good airplanes with parachutes? To have a rush. Why do they eat foods that burn on the way out as well as the way in? Why do they watch movies that they think may make them cry? It's because they want to experience the totality of the human experience, what their potential is. So it's adaptability that defines life. So what do you need to effectively adapt, to express life, to express your potential? Very simply, a nervous system that's working without interference. That's how it all begins. So if we look at adaptability, there's R.W. Stevenson, author of Chiropractic Textbook. And adaptability, as some of you may remember, is the third sign of life. As Stevenson stated, it's the intellectual ability that an organism possesses of responding to all forces which come to it, whether innate or universal. It's a physical process that takes place. It's the expression of intellectual adaptation. It's the physical personification of it. And it's recently emerged that individual adaptability depends upon the interaction of several mechanisms. And the mechanisms that scientists have described that are involved in this process of adaptability are integration of genetic epigenetic and environmental factors. And what are they seeking to do? To coordinate and regulate adaptations. Biological pathways to adaptability include interactions between the genome, your genetic legacy, what you receive from your parents, interactions between the genome and the epigenome, the expression, which genes are turned on, which are turned off, which, as we're going to see, are a byproduct in part of the lifestyle choices that you make. And the nervous system and the environment, going back to what D.D. Palmer talked about, going back to what Dr. Barge talked about. And where did this stuff come from? It came from a journal. The journal name itself is kind of inspiring: Genes, Brain, and Behavior. So can we measure adaptability? Yes, we can. D.D. Palmer talked about life being an expression of tone, how tone is the normal degree of nerve tension. It's expressed and functioned by normal elasticity, strength, and excitability. The cause of disease is a variation in tone. So when we speak of muscle tone, what are we talking about? We're talking that ambient level of muscle activity that's happening in the background without you even knowing it. When we look at the greater context of tone, as described by D.D. Palmer, we're talking about what he called the degree of nerve tension, kind of the dance between the efferent and the afferent leg of the safety pin cycle. BJ wrote, nerves are mediums of transmission of innate mental impulses from the brain to all tissues in the body. The only abnormality possible is lack of function. He further wrote, a mental impulse is an incitement of the mind by innate or spirit in the form of an abrupt and vivid suggestion, prompting some unpremeditated action or leading to unforeseen knowledge or insight. And I'm actually working on my ACP thesis, and it's on the mental impulse. So I'm kind of thinking a lot about that and looking at how the concept of mental impulse developed over time in the writings of the Palmers and others. And Stevenson wrote, and I think this is great, we might conceive of this mental impulse as being such forces in the tissue cell as electricity, valency, magnetism, cohesion, etc. Perhaps some of these energies are not known to us in physics. What right have we to assume that we have found them all? Very significant. X-rays existed before they were discovered by Röntgen. DNA and its double helical structure exhibited a mystery. People knew something about genetics, but they didn't know about the double helical structure of DNA. And then when Watson and Crick described that, people thought that was the beginning and the end. And now we know that it's epigenetics, turning those genes on and off and altering their expression in response to environmental dynamics. That's it. So we have to realize that conventional science, mechanistic science, is limited by the technology of the times. And I think it was very wise of Stevenson to have had the insight to realize maybe we don't know all of these things. Maybe there are energies, maybe there are mechanisms not known to us. And in studying the mental impulse, and as many of you know, I'm director of the Center for Scholarly Activity at Sherman College and also president of the Foundation for Vertebral Subluxation. And my area of interest has been neurobiological mechanisms associated with vertebral subluxation. And we're seeing that there is an intimate biochemical communication network that exists between the nervous system and the immune system. We're seeing as well that there are mechanisms of non-synaptic transmission, such as what's called ephaptic transmission or field effects, where an electromagnetic field surrounding one nerve influences another. So we're seeing that there's all kinds of stuff beyond the action potential, beyond what conventional neurology has taught us. And this is all very exciting, cutting edge stuff. So can we measure this elusive mental impulse? Well, one of the first attempts to do so in a mechanistic way was BJ's development of an instrument called the electroencephaloneuromantimpograph. And that's really a mouthful. If you kind of break it down, electrical, he was looking at electrical signals, encephalo, beginning at the brain. You can see in the illustration that he has electrodes on the patient's head. Encephaloneuro, looking at the nervous system, mentimpo, mental impulse graph. And you can't see the lower right, but there are also electrodes on her leg. And what BJ was trying to do was to trace the propagation of the mental impulse from the brain cell to the tissue cell and potentially identify areas along the spine where there was interference. And this is the actual instrument that recorded it. The procedure itself was performed in a grounded and shielded booth because of the possibility of there being electrical interference. And you can see, if you look closely in the lower right of the right-hand thing, there are batteries. That's because the signal from the mains, from the line, caused so much interference, they had to use batteries to power the amplifiers. So pretty primitive, and the results were never really published, but it was a step. And what we know now is that by looking at how effectively the heart is being modulated by the nervous system in response to environmental demand, we can get some pretty good measures of adaptability. And the technology for doing that is called HRV, or heart rate variability. And when we talk about HRV, I remember an encounter I had with a chiropractic researcher, and I won't mention what school he was from, but he said, he's a non-chiropractor, PhD. And he said, the problem with you chiropractors is that you claim that the nervous system is the master system of the body, that everything in the body is controlled by the nervous system. He said, and that's simply not true. I said, well, why would you say that? And he said, because I can remove a beating heart from an animal, even from a human being, and it will continue to beat outside the body without any connection to the nervous system at all. And I said, well, let's continue this experiment, this thought experiment in our mind. If it were possible for the person you remove this heart from to start running, would the heart start beating faster in response to the increased environmental demand? And he said, oh. And I said, yeah. I said, the heart has an intrinsic pacemaker. We know that. It'll beat about 100, 110 beats per minute with no connection. But the thing that allows the heart to adapt to changes in demand is the innervation of the vagus primarily, which modulates that intrinsic pacemaker. So by looking at the power spectrum of the time between heartbeats, what's called the interbeat interval, we can infer a patient's level of adaptive capacity, and we can also look at the balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic system, which is pretty cool stuff. And people might say, well, so what? Well, it's significant because heart rate variability has been used in a variety of disciplines to look at how well the body adapts and how it's able to adapt to specific health challenges. In a couple journal articles recently, it was shown that cognitive function is associated with impaired heart rate variability, that it predicts control over memory retrieval, and that heart rate variability was associated with worse cognitive performance, at least in a cohort of elderly Mexican Americans. That heart rate variability affects the prognosis in cancer. Indeed, there are some investigators, and again, this is conventional medicine, this isn't alternative stuff, who said that heart rate variability can be a better predictor of clinical outcomes than histopathological slides and staging. that the presence of cancer in combination with decreased heart rate variability is associated with shorter survival time. Here's another one, looking at brain metastasis. The results suggested that the SDNN, that's the standard deviation of the interbeat intervals, that's a measure of HRV, may be an independent negative prognosticator of survival. And the thing that's really significant is that heart rate variability has been associated with all-cause mortality. In other words, regardless of your clinical state, if your heart rate variability is compromised, mortality rises. So what else? Things like obesity, things like aging, basically anything that might have a negative impact on your well-being tends to manifest as decreased HRV. So what makes it better? Well, things that are good for you, obviously. Heart rate variability has been shown to be increased in people who meditate, practice yoga, practice Tai Chi. These mind-body integrated procedures have been shown to increase heart rate variability and therefore adaptive potential. And what else? Chiropractic. Wait till you see this. Suboccipital decompression enhances heart rate variability indices of cardiac control in healthy subjects. So that's kind of wordy. Let's break it down. They're looking at the upper cervical spine. They're looking at the occipital-atlantoaxial region. We're looking at healthy subjects, asymptomatic subjects, people with no symptoms. And what they did was assess the craniocervical junction. They applied what they called cervical spine manipulation. And as we know, spinal manipulation and the location analysis and correction of vertebral subluxation are not the same thing, but these were not chiropractors, but osteopaths. And what they did was come up with data that supported the hypothesis that upper cervical spine manipulation can acutely affect measures of heart rate variability in healthy individuals. And this is the part that I think is really powerful. This effect was seen in healthy subjects free of injury or somatic dysfunction. In other words, these weren't musculoskeletal pain patients. They were healthy patients. And therefore, it was not due to a treatment effect associated with an underlying musculoskeletal condition, that these healthy people benefited from having their upper cervical spines corrected, even in the absence of symptoms. The only sad thing is this was done by osteopaths, not chiropractors. And when I see things like this, again, it gets me more enthusiastic about what we're doing. And I'm hoping that we're going to be able to get more involved in HRV research at Sherman College. As Alvin mentioned, I'm no longer associated with CLA. That's been the case for a long time, but I still have an interest in heart rate variability. The availability of cone beam CT, I think, is very exciting. And the Foundation for Vertebral Subluxation has just launched a major initiative that's going to look at control of immunogenesis by the nervous system and its association with vertebral subluxation. And we're proposing a long multi-year subject. So a lot of exciting stuff in the offing. But we have to be very careful. If we want to survive as a profession, we have to have a unique service to offer. And as you know, a variety of professions offer spinal manipulation. Osteopaths do it. Manual medicine physicians do it. Here in the United States, physical therapists have obtained legislation that allows them to perform spinal manipulation without a referral. And again, a colloquialism here in the US is, a joint is a marijuana cigarette. So I like to say, vertebral subluxation is not the same thing as joint dysfunction. So we have to be very careful in our research and publications. If we talk about spinal manipulation, we're empowering other professions that are utilizing this. Instead of it being a unique service, it becomes homogenized, it becomes genericized, and we lose our identity. So back to heart rate variability. John Zhang, an MD, PhD, who used to be director of research at Sherman College, looked at 625 patients in 96 practices and did a single pre-post assessment. And he was able to follow 132 of these patients over a 4-week period. So a lot of the work that's been done regarding neurobiological changes when various inputs are applied to the spine, be it spinal manipulation or specific adjustment, have just looked at a single pre-post thing. And obviously what we need to start doing is following people over time. You know, if you punch somebody in the face, you're going to get a response in the frontal cortex. You know, the question is, if you correct a vertebral subluxation, are you over time going to have a sustained favorable change in neurophysiological function? Well, Jean looked at 132 of these patients in 96 different practices over a 4-week period, and he reported that the heart rate variability analysis indicated that chiropractic was associated with a shift to a healthy nervous system balance. And I recently published a review looking at all the stuff that I could find in the literature regarding HRV in either spinal manipulation or chiropractic adjustment. And we found about 20 different papers. And it's interesting, about half of them used spinal manipulation. The other half used specific chiropractic adjustments. And in some cases, the description in the journal article of what was done was so poor, it was so incomplete, you couldn't tell. So how can this work? Well, back in, oh goodness, I think it was 1996, when I published a review article on mechanisms of vertebral subluxation, models of vertebral subluxation, I came up with a word, disafferentation. And in those days, the functional neurology people were talking about deafferentation. And I said, well, deafferentation kind of has an all or none inference. You're either getting the input or you're not. And I went back to, you know, the traditional Green Book philosophy, which talked about there being a qualitative and a quantitative aspect to neural communication. And I said, let's use the term disafferentation because it relates to dysfunction as opposed to complete severance of communication. So it's really not even my word. Back in 1948, Erwin Core, he didn't use the term disafferentation, but he talked about dysfunction of afferent input. And back in the 1960s, a group of chiropractors at CMCC came up with a great conceptual framework. They referred to a thing they called the neural image. And the neural image is the body's perception of the internal and external environment. How effectively is the body able to integrate that dynamic? And in the computer world, they talk about garbage in, garbage out. And the concept is disafferentation suggests that if the body's perception of what's going on in the environment is compromised, if the body's not getting good information, its ability to make an appropriate response will be compromised. And by the way, this concept of the neural image resulted in a book called Segmental Neuropathy. And the cool thing is it's available free online, Segmental Neuropathy, on Simon Senzon's site, Philosophy of Chiropractic. So here's a page from that book, and in it, they expanded on D.D. Palmer's concept of tone and attempted to contemporize it based on their understanding of neuroanatomy. And they said, you know, there's all this stuff in the intervertebral motion segment. We have innervation of the disc. We have innervation of the muscles, of the ligaments. Not included on this, but discovered and published, is innervation of meninges. We know that the posterior joints, the zygapophyseal joints, have very complex innervation with various types of mechanoreceptors, some rapidly adapting, some slowly adapting. And you might say, why is all that stuff there? The reason all that stuff is there is because apparently it's pretty important to the brain to have information about what's going on there. So the third item in the TIC Triad, and the last one, is epigenetics. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Bruce Lipton's work. He wrote a great book called The Biology of Belief. And I was privileged to interview him On Purpose. And interviewing Bruce is certainly like drinking from a fire hose, as they say. The stuff that comes out of his mouth is so powerful and so fast. There were a couple times I had to kind of ask him to pause so I could process it. And one of the more profound things that he said in that interview was that a cell cannot be in growth and defense at the same time. Where is this coming from? Not coming from me. Interesting. So anyway, a cell cannot be in growth and defense at the same time. And I said, well, if that's true, we should be able to scale that concept. That would mean that a person can't be in growth and defense at the same time. A family can't be in growth and defense at the same time. A city can't be in growth and defense at the same time. A nation can't be in growth and defense at the same time. And a profession can't be in growth and defense at the same time. Boy, does that ring true today. We've got to get out of defense and into growth. We have to transition from a pathogenic model that's focusing on a disease that's perceived to be a threat and get into a salutogenic model where we're looking at strategies to express our potential and more effectively deal with any real or perceived threats. Well, Bruce Lipton's passion is debunking what has been called the dogma of genetic supremacy. And there we have Watson and Crick. And of course, as you know, Watson and Crick came up with the double helical model of DNA. They have this kind of sugar base, and then you have pyrimidines and purines, and you have adenine and guanine, cytosine, thiazine, and how these things are lined up determine your destiny as an individual. And initially, people thought this was kind of exciting because now we know. But the downside of this model, as Bruce has so eloquently described, is that it's kind of fatalistic. It suggests that there's nothing we can do, that we're kind of stuck with our genetics. But we're starting to see these instances where environmental dynamics are changing genetic expression. In fact, on the cover of Time magazine, they started talking about epigenetics. I just love this picture of the zipper and the double helix. And it says, why DNA isn't your destiny. The new science of epigenetics reveals how the choices you make can change your genes and those of your kids. Well, that's not really true. They kind of took some journalistic liberties there. You're not changing the genome. What you're changing are which genes are turned on and turned off. And the exciting thing about this is that it suggests that the decisions that we make and the actions we take in our life can change our genetic expression, and that these changes last at least a few generations from what we can tell. For example, there are studies looking at individuals who suffered through famines. There are studies looking at the grandchildren of individuals who survived the Holocaust. And what they're finding is that epigenetic changes occurred that basically persisted through time, allowing them to adapt. So what's this got to do with chiropractic? A lot. As we live life, our DNA is damaged. As we age, our ability to repair DNA is compromised. And decades ago, Ron Perot, a PhD researcher, he was doing cancer research, became interested in chiropractic and looked at DNA repair enzymes in people who were under chiropractic care versus those who weren't. And unfortunately, his paper was never published in a peer-reviewed journal. And I ran into a chiropractor, Clay Campbell in Canada, who knew Dr. Perot. And I contacted him. I said, would you be interested in doing a similar study with us? And he said, sure. So we put together a team um, involving his colleagues at the University of Lund. And we published a paper, Surrogate Indication of DNA Repair in Long-Term Chiropractic Intervention. Serum thiols are surrogate indicated DNA repair enzymes. And what we found was very interesting. We found that people who were under long-term chiropractic care had higher levels of DNA repair enzymes than did age and gender matched controls, significantly higher than people with chronic disease, but that if people terminated chiropractic care early in the game, they did not achieve those benefits. And amazingly, this was picked up by Medical News Today. We kind of had our 15 minutes of fame. And they wrote, there's a growing body of evidence that wellness care provided by doctors of chiropractic may reduce healthcare costs, improve health behaviors, as well as patient perceived quality of life. But they didn't know how this happened on a cellular level. And they wrote, in a landmark study published this week in the Journal of Vertebral Subluxation Research, chiropractors collaborating with research at the University of Lund found that chiropractic care could improve basic physiological processes affecting oxidative stress and DNA repair. We had hoped to secure funding for a larger study. It never happened, but I never give up hope. So in today's challenging world, we sometimes hear people talk about how they need to reduce stress, manage stress, eliminate stress in their life. And the person who originally applied the engineering concept of stress to biological systems was a guy named Hans Selye. And he wrote The Stress of Life. He's the individual who really conceived the idea. And it happened, as he told us at Palmer, one day when he was a medical student. We were very privileged to have him speak to our students, and I was on the faculty at the time, and he made himself available for a meeting with the faculty after, which was really cool, just getting to have some private time with Dr. Selye. And he said, this is how it happened. He said, I was sitting in a class in differential diagnosis, and it was in an amphitheater type room. And the instructor would bring patients with various conditions before the class and say, here are the clinical findings, here's the case history, here are the laboratory findings, here are the imaging findings, what are the differentials, and how would you make a diagnosis? What would your diagnosis be? How would you rationalize it? How would you differentiate one condition from another that had similar clinical findings? What would be the subtle differences? And Selye said, I was sitting there looking at these patients going across the room and listening to the student responses. And I said, all of these patients have some things in common. Maybe it's not the subtle differences between one disease and another, but the things that all sick patients have in common that we should be looking at. And he said the professor saw that his mind was wandering and, of course, called on him and said, well, Selye, what do you think is wrong with this man? And Selye said, well, doctor, he's sick. And his classmates laughed at him, but it really got him started on a path. And what Selye wrote was that every living being has a certain innate amount of adaptation energy or vitality. And I think it's inspiring that Selye back then, came up with the concept of there being an innate amount of adaptation energy or vitality. And when people say they want a stress-free life, I say, no, you don't, because that's not going to happen until the day that you die. As Selye noted, complete absence of stress is incompatible with life, since only a dead man makes no demand upon his body or mind. It's adaptation and stress that separate the living from the non-living. So Selye talked about there being two forms of stress: eustress or positive stress, and distress or stress. And unfortunately, most people today, when they talk about stress, just talk about distress. But eustress is positive stress. And what research in physiology has shown us is that if you perceive a challenge as being a threat, you go into freeze, fight, flight. You have activation of the HPA axis. You are in a situation involving sympathetic dominance. Porges discovered in polyvagal theory and described how this can happen. There's a lot going on there. And it's bad for you if you have no means of expressing this. These primitive neurological responses that are no longer appropriate. We don't have to worry about running away from a saber-toothed tiger. We have other challenges. But if, on the other hand, you perceive a situation as an opportunity for growth, and you see the positive changes that can occur, an entirely different chain of physiologic responses occur that are favorable. And fortunately, human beings can transmute distress into eustress by using the rational mind. But as Will Rogers, an American humorist, wrote, even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. You have to do something. And I'll leave you with this thought, and then we've got a few minutes, I guess, for discussion if you want to. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mead. So we'll get out of here. And if any of you have any thoughts you want to share, or any questions,
Well, thank
I'm
you.
here.
Unmute you guys if you want to speak or type something. I thought it was really cool how you talked about, with a rational mind, we can transform distress into eustress. And sometimes I get people tell me after they get adjusted, like, I can think clearly again.
Exactly. We hear that all the time.
Like, they're like, I'm here now. I'm like, okay, I'm back. I'm like, where were you, right? So.
Well, that's true. They're in a different place physiologically and psycho-emotionally. There's no question about it. And, the thing that really gets me, I think of the individuals, and this is kind of what drives me during difficult times. We certainly all have them. Imagine going through life subluxated. I've been involved in individuals in pediatrics with the ICPA. And when you see these dramatic changes that take place in infants and children, as well as the dramatic changes that take place in adults, you think, what if this person never had that subluxation adjusted? What would it be like to go through life without chiropractic? We tend to take it for granted. I've been under care since I was a teenager, and I just can't imagine what life would be like without. Yet this is the life that most people are living.
So I had some questions maybe about HRV. Do you think that's something practical for us to use in practice to kind of educate, to measure and track, and how can we measure it in a way that's useful for research?
Yes, absolutely true. Heart rate variability is available. Dr. Gentempo and I kind of brought it to the profession on a larger level with the Insight subluxation station. But basically, you can use almost any device that can reliably produce time between systoles. So there are thousands of chiropractors using heart rate variability. The standard protocol that's used involves doing a 5-minute acquisition. So it's usually not done pre and post adjustment. Some do, some have an assistant or a paraprofessional perform the study for them. But most people use it on reexaminations to see how well a person's adaptive capacity as well as sympathetic parasympathetic balance has changed over time. So yes, the cool thing about heart rate variability is, unlike something like functional MRI, which is very expensive and very time consuming and requires equipment far beyond the reach of most chiropractors' budgets, heart rate variability is a reasonable thing to do in your practice, and there are a lot of people doing it.
Usually it's about 5 minutes. You want them to kind of just calm down before they take a reading, right?
Well, we'd like them to acclimate before. The American Heart Association recommends about a 5-minute acclimation time before you run the graph. A lot of people have removed that and only do 1 minute. It kind of depends on where they were before. If they just rushed in and they're all amped up, obviously they need to acclimate and to calm down. What some chiropractors have told me is that they don't use the full 5-minute acclimation time because by the time they do the study, the patient is pretty mellow and has been sitting there for a while. But yeah, the best way to do it would be to have them acclimate before you do the actual acquisition.
Maybe just kind of question is how quiet does the environment need to be? Because some of us might be in very busy, bustling practices.
Well, hopefully you're not doing it in your reception room or parking lot. If you're doing it in the adjusting room, probably the most important aspect of this is that whatever environment you're doing it in is similar during different acquisitions.
So Dr. Shan has some questions.
Okay.
From Singapore. Do you want to read it to us? We ask about how to use HRV or any other ways or any other things we could do. It's kind of talking about how we can contribute to research. So if we got that data, how can we submit it to? How do we qualify that our data is useful to you? And then,
well, first of all, you have to make sure you're getting good data. In other words, that there are no artifacts in the signal and so forth, and that you've used a standardized protocol. At this point, I'm not aware of any practice-based studies using HRV, but I'd certainly like to see that happen. A practice-based research network is where you have a network of chiropractors basically who use the same protocol and then submit their data to a centralized database so that we can pool them and get good numbers. And I'd love to see that happen with HRV, but to my knowledge, there's no such study currently going on.
How many practices involved would be good to start with?
Well, there's really no magic number. I know of one practice-based research network involving some psycho-emotional questionnaires that has 10 practices, and they're asking them each to have 10 patients participate so that there are 100 subjects. So you can start small. There doesn't really have to be a huge number of participants, but they do have to be committed enough to make sure that there's follow through and that they follow the protocol.
Okay. And then Dr. Sean is asking, you mentioned upper cervical adjustments having an impact on HRV. Can segments have a similar effect?
There really hasn't been anything comparing the two that I'm aware of, but we have seen favorable improvements in HRV with a wide variety of chiropractic techniques. So it doesn't have to be just upper cervical technique. There's a PhD researcher I had an opportunity to speak to who's very interested in HRV and has spoken at some chiropractic events. And unfortunately, he's kind of locked into the medical model of, so if a person is sympathetic dominant, you can stimulate the parasympathetics by adjusting, the upper cervical spine or the sacrum. And, if they're parasympathetic and you want to amp up the sympathetics, you bang on the dorsals and so forth. And I said, no, 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 that's not what we do as chiropractors. What we do as chiropractors, regardless of what our specific technique approach might be, is to analyze the patient for vertebral subluxations, adjust them wherever we find them, because we don't want to educatedly decide what needs to be stimulated or inhibited. We want to remove interference with the body's ability to make that decision. And he found that very difficult to grasp, unfortunately. But the short answer to the question is yes. In fact, if you're interested, I'd encourage you to look at my review article. It's in Research and Reviews Neuroscience. I can send the URL, or you can just Google it, on heart rate variability and vertebral subluxation, where we reviewed the 20 or so studies, and they involve a variety of techniques, both upper cervical and full spine. Okay.
Who else has any questions? Everyone's shy. I had some questions about big data now. You know, like, is there a way we can get big data to help us, or is there research big data? Like, how does that, because everyone's collecting stuff, right? What are they collecting? How can it impact? I had questions.
Well, again, there have been some. Did you say there was a question, or do you want me to address that first?
You address that first, yeah.
Okay. Some of these studies have used data that is already available. For example, the Medicare data that we talked about earlier, where they're saying, well, how can we compare people under chiropractic care with those who weren't, and what their Medicare expenditures were? So that's kind of a way of mining a very large database. There's a question as to how much specificity you have there. We don't know what was done to those people, other than that here in the US, the only thing that Medicare covers for chiropractors is correction of vertebral subluxation. So we know it's that. But what technique? We don't know. How long were they under care? We're not quite sure. So again, mining databases requires you to have good data. Now, when it comes to collecting large amounts of data, where you can design prospectively what data is going to be collected, that's a whole new game. But again, that requires practitioners in sufficient numbers who have the commitment to collect that data in a consistent fashion.
So there's a concept I had, and I'm trying to actually get developers involved. So maybe if anyone has resources to connect me with. I was thinking of trying to just track people's proprioception through just like a VR headset type thing. And then, baseline, what their range of motion is, how quality of motion, then if they do rehab following the screen, or if they have an intervention with a chiropractor, and then gamify the experience. So that we can
actually, there's a study that's going to start at Sherman College, I hope, once the lockdown is over with and we're back in the health center business, doing just that. That's looking at repositioning error related to range of motion and indicators of vertebral subluxation. There have been a couple of studies, I think, with spinal manipulation and repositioning error. It's a pretty well accepted measure of central integration. So yeah, that'd be a great thing to do.
Cool. I'm going to connect with you more on that.
Anyone else? We're a little over an hour, but that's okay. If anyone else has something, I'm willing to stay a little bit more.
They might all be digesting everything you said earlier. Is this eustress I'm feeling, or distress right now?
I hope eustress. I hope it's eustress.
Sounds over my head, but I think it is recorded, and we're going to put it online in our Facebook group for you guys. So make sure you connect with me or whoever got you onto this call, so that you can digest this stuff. Hearing Chris's voice is kind of like I don't know how to describe it. It's just very, very comforting for me because I grew up listening to it. My chiropractic growth was from that. I just listened to him for hours.
Well, that's kind of funny because occasionally, people will tell me. I remember I met a woman at a seminar once who said, you know, I've gone to bed with you many times, and I was a little bit shocked. I said, "What?"
I haven't done that with you yet, though.
I don't think I recognize you. But anyway, she said, yeah, I listened on purpose before I go to sleep. I said, hopefully not to help induce sleep. And she laughed and said, no, I just like to do that. So yeah, it's fun. And for those of you that, that's the commercial. If anyone is interested in learning more about On Purpose, you can just go to chiroonpurpose.com.
Actually, good. Actually, you can press down.
I'm seeing a cutoff message. It says, to get into research, do you have ... Anyway.
And then it says a recommendation for how to connect with local IRBs.
There are a number of IRBs available. The Foundation for Vertebral Subluxation has one for individuals that are interested in doing research involving human subjects. In terms of commercial IRBs, they're available too. Can be kind of costly. If you're collaborating with an institution such as a chiropractic college or a university, they all have IRBs. So if you have a co-investigator or a principal investigator who's associated with an institution already, you can usually use their IRB. If you're an individual field practitioner, I would recommend working with the IRB at the Foundation for Vertebral Subluxation.
Is there maybe kind of a different thing? Is there any kind of is there any research with kids?
Yeah, very exciting stuff. The ICPA, the International Chiropractic Pediatric Association, has a practice-based research network. Their director of research, Joel Alcantara, has published a number of papers looking at safety and perceived effectiveness of pediatric chiropractic. And there was a published paper recently, very exciting. I don't recall the name of it, but it was out of the UK. The AECC rather clinic was one of the participants. Plus, I think they had 14 or 15 private practices as well. And they had mothers complete questionnaires on the changes that happened in their children under chiropractic care. And the results were spectacular. But what I found even more interesting was they also looked at the mothers and how their perception of joy from motherhood and reduction in anxiety and depression were changed. So yeah, there is some pediatric chiropractic stuff out there. We certainly need more, but it's very exciting.
Because we have Sherman grad Dennis Young online here too. I wonder if he's able to hear us, because he actually is involved with a lot of schools in Hong Kong. So if there's measures where that we can maybe get, he runs a center called Kids First. Dennis.
Sure. Connect with me. I'll hook you up with the ICPA people. Armand Rossi, who's our Dean of Clinical Science, teaches for the ICPA and is very active. Ron Castellucci, another one of our faculty members, is active with the ICPA. So if you'd like to collaborate with them, we'll see what happens.
Cool. On that note, with the ICPA, we have actually asked Peter Kevorkian, your pledge brother, right?
Yes, my pledge brother in Delta Sigma Chi.
I've asked him to speak with us on June 3rd, Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. Because he likes to do evenings instead of mornings, so we flip-flop that schedule. So that's in 2 weeks' time. He's going to be talking about, how to family-based chiropractic care and lifetime care,
And he's done it. I mean, he has what many people would consider the dream practice. So, yeah, I think you'll really enjoy that.
So, all right, guys, if no one else has anything else you want to ask, we're gonna let Dr. Chris go, and he probably needs to start teaching soon and other many things.
So anyway, thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad you recorded it so people who were unable to attend
I
can have
recorded it
access to it. Pardon?
I recorded it because I want to rewatch this because I need to.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I guess then you will or will not make it available to others. It's up to you.
I definitely will make it available because I think this.
You're certainly welcome to make it available to anyone you wish.
I think it really the TIC Triad. You know, I've seen you speak on that before, and it just time to digest and think about like my notes here is like I need to do a talk on epigenetics. I need to talk on eustress to my practice members.
Absolutely.
You know, when the time is right, when you hear things over and over again, then when you become ready, then you know it happens. So we got a lot of thank yous going out, and
okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. This is kind of interesting because, I got it now. I was going to say, gee, I only see 4 things on the screen, but then I see there's an arrow where there are a bunch more. So, okay.
We got you there.
Okay. Well, all right. Thanks a lot.
So much.
And we'll see you down the road.
Okay, we'll be in touch, brother. Love you.
Bye.